if you're there, I guess we should start recording. Is that all right with you? Because for all the participants, for the people who are on, these programs are recorded and then they're shown later on CCTV, which is channel 17. And I'll send you out notice of when that happens. Okay? Is that all right? Hi, Joanne. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
So,
Hi, Joanna, Tim.
Are we supposed
Hey.
to say hola?
hola.
Hola.
Yeah, right.
Buenos días.
Buenas
Okay.
tardes.
Buenas tardes.
So I guess Megan will start recording if that's okay. My name is Sandy Barrett and welcome to our VICII presentation tonight in the Spanish-American War and the decision, I think, on the part of the United States to extend its destiny to the Pacific and to all of Latin America. The Spanish-American War was in 1898 and continued really probably until 1902 or 1903 when there was an agreement made to actually get Guantanamo and to have an American base in Cuba. So I welcome everybody's participation and conversation. This is mainly, I hope, an evening that we can converse about that very important manifest destiny. I call manifest destiny 2. Manifest destiny first on the part of the United States, or at least the Anglophone areas of the United States, was to extend those 13 English-speaking colonies to the coast, to the West Coast. And remember, that was more or less successful certainly by 1898, although there were states, I think, that came into the United States after that point, mainly Alaska and also Hawaii. But in 1898, I wanted just to mention that the United States was still competing with world powers for ascendancy, I think, in the Pacific and also in China and also in all of Latin America. There were 2 remaining colonies in Latin America and the Caribbean that were owned by Spain at the time. Those 2 colonies were Cuba and Puerto Rico. The United States in this war took advantage of the Cuban struggle for independence in Cuba against Spain. And the United States took advantage of that and interceded supposedly on behalf of the Cuban independistas. But at the end of that war, which was concluded fairly quickly, the United States retained a hold over Cuba and Puerto Rico both. The results of that, the consequences of that for both of those former, also colonies, were different, however. Cuba more or less became an independent nation at that time at the end of the Spanish-American War and threw off the Spanish colonial empire. However, they were left by being rather crippled by the then powerful United States. In a series of amendments, a series of laws, the United States, through the Platt Amendment, kept control over the foreign policy of Cuba so that Cuba could not be an independent actor on the world stage in any way. Cuba had to remain more or less loyal to the American empire. Secondly, in Puerto Rico, and I hope that Jorge addresses himself more to this, Joanne and Tim also, who both come from Puerto Rico or grew up there. Puerto Rico was more or less incorporated into the United States and made what was called a Commonwealth of the United States, which I believe left Puerto Rico in a less independent state, certainly, than Cuba, and became part of the United States, but not clearly a state, not clearly a colony either. Puerto Ricans are left in a sort of a limbo position of not either being an independent country or not fully incorporated as a state into the United States. At the same time, if you regard the Spanish-American War as a contest for Spain, to basically replace the Spanish Empire in the world, more or less, the United States also sought to control the Pacific at that time and began a slow march, I believe, aimed at China, aimed at having influence in China. It was at the same time that the other superpowers of the world were also competing for China, for the markets of China. The superpowers at that time being England, France, Germany, and the rising Japan as well. So the United States had to basically replaced the Spanish Empire in Latin America, but also in the Pacific began to try a march toward being hegemonic in the Pacific. That included Hawaii. That's when Hawaii was conquered by the United States, and on to the Philippines, when the United States essentially got the Spanish Empire out of the Philippines, and the United States became the powerful in the Philippines. With us tonight to speak more about this march to empire, with the consequences of that, are Jorge Rodriguez from Puerto Rico, Armando from Cuba, and Grant Crisriel, who'll talk a little bit about Hawaii as well. People don't, I think, realize anything much about the conquest of Hawaii. I don't think Americans really know either about Puerto Rico or Cuba, but I think that the whole situation in Hawaii was rather unknown to most Americans. Hawaii now is a state. It became a state, I think, in 1959. Is that correct?
58.
58. Puerto Rico is not a state, and Cuba is an independent country, but it's paid a very heavy price
59.
for that. You're right, 59. Hawaii came in 59. But Cuba has paid a very heavy price because in 1959, the Cubans had a socialist revolution in Cuba, and they have since that time paid the heavy price of the United States through an embargo against Cuba and through an attempt to, I think, change the regime in Cuba to have a regime in Cuba that's more friendly to the United States. But anyway, maybe we'll start with maybe Puerto Rico. Is that okay with everybody? And maybe Jorge can talk a little bit about the situation in Puerto Rico. Okay, go ahead.
I'm going to put a presentation up, but I don't know that you're going to see it, but I'm just going to put it for me. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, perfect. I'm seeing a presentation that I prepared, but you're not seeing it, but it's okay. I'll just give you, in a nutshell, what I see the Spanish-American War, especially in the Caribbean, is a consolidation of U.S. Expansion, which started, like Sandy says, to the west and then continued in the Caribbean. And of course, the countries that were targeted were Cuba and Puerto Rico. I'm going to talk more about Puerto Rico, but I'll just say a few things because this was part of a grand plan. Between 1898 and 1924, there were 8 countries that were intervened by the U.S., okay? And most of them multiple times between the 1920s and they were Panama, Nicaragua, Mexico during the second, revolution, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and Honduras, and of course Cuba and Puerto Rico. I'll say a little bit about Puerto Rico. It's about 3,500 square miles.
Square feet.
I think it's about 15 times smaller than Cuba. So it's really was an important economic colony for Spain. In those years, Cuba was the king. But I have to remind you that in the 500 years of history, both Cuba and Puerto Rico were completely unimportant because the money was in the gold and the silver in Mexico and Peru and Bolivia. So, so it was later than when actually the Spaniards took the advantage of the Haitian Revolution and the growth, the Spaniards, learning that the sugar production was super, important, and they started their empire in the 1800s. And that's where the sugar boom came for Cuba, which probably meant about 50% of the Spain's economy, which is huge. So but Puerto Rico, as compared to that, was much smaller, much less important. And there's a few things that are important about Puerto Rico, and especially as different from Cuba, is that Puerto Rico really had a multi-crop. They weren't heavy into sugar cane because it wasn't big enough and it wasn't important enough. So we, in Puerto Rico, there was more crops, and that was tobacco and coffee. Okay. So that is a difference. So when I'll just say a few things just before the occupation in 1868 was a kind of like a series of rising in Lares. About 600 people got involved. And then just half a year before the occupation, the 1897 Carta Autonómica gave Puerto Rico a legendary, kind of like autonomy. Really, if you look at it, it wasn't complete autonomy, but the Puerto Ricans had a lot more rights under these new conditions, granted a lot of liberties that we didn't have in the previous 400 years. Mm-hmm. And just that lasted about 3 months. And then in July, the U.S. occupation started. July 13th, it lasted a month, okay? In December 10th, there was a Treaty of Paris that granted Puerto Rico, to the U.S. I just say a few details. It was General Nelson Mines with 18,000 troops that invaded the southwest coast of Puerto Rico in Guanica, but it quickly spread all the way through on the way to San Juan. And again, in 1 month, they took over the island. A few things. Immediately, there was a law that was called the Foraker Law. Basically, after the about 6 or 7 months of military occupation, there was the imposition of a civilian government with an appointed governor by the president of the U.S., Supreme Court appointed by the president of the United States, and there were 35 elected representatives. In quotes, I mean, it was kind of like the first House of Representatives, but all federal laws applied, okay? Another law that's not talked too much that was more important economically was the Hollander Law. The Hollander Law in 1901 imposed a 1% tax on all land. So imagine all the landowners in Puerto Rico now had to pay 1%. But not only that, they devalued the Puerto Rican peso, which was a Spanish peso, 40%. Mm-hmm. So everybody who had, $100, now they had $60 mm-hmm. instead of 100. And so what that made is what happened is there was a heavy expropriation of land. Basically, the U.S. wanted to reestablish a sugar monocrop economy, capitalist plantations, mega plantations. So they had a few landowners that were able to grab land from small landowners, and that immediately created a large labor force. All these former, small farm owners, now whether they were laborers, they could be laborers for these large plantations, okay? Mm-hmm. And that lasted for about 30 years. Now, in between, well, of course, they changed to monocrop now, sugar plantations versus multi-crops.
Right.
And the small farmers becomes workers. In 1917, the Jones Act granted U.S. citizenships to Puerto Ricans, but that didn't come, cheap. We also had to sign an agreement that we had to use the U.S. Marine naval merchant marines. So we are, Puerto Ricans were not at liberty to choose who was going to transport the goods. And in an island, well, you need to transport everything. That is key. That's like the lifeblood. Well, in the 1930s, nationalist movement rose, and they've been, significant, but very, very little, but they were very hard hit by the U.S. government and the FBI. Of course, we all remember the attacks on the Blair House and the Congress by Puerto Ricans. That was part of all that movement. And in 1948, for the first time, we could elect a governor, okay? And then that followed what 1952, the new constitution, which, like Sandy says, is the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rican words, it's called the Free Associated State, the Estado Libre Asociado. But it's still, we still have federal courts. We still have some army bases, although most of them are gone. And, of course, the U.S. Post Office, we are under federal authority. Politically today, we can't vote for a president unless I move to this country like I did, and you can do it easily. You just move, but you can't live in Puerto Rico, reside there, and vote for the president. Oddly enough, you can vote for the candidate. So you on the
primary.
The primaries,
right.
All the presidents, they love Puerto Ricans. They want to get nominated. They go there and get the few delegates that we got. We have a representative on the Congress, And I don't know if I can go on, but I think time is of the essence, and I don't know if you wanted me to expand to what's the situation now.
Yeah, I think maybe we could maybe leave that for questions, or does anybody? I mean, maybe
Exactly.
we could ask Armando and Grant also. Okay.
Exactly.
Armando.
I thought that would be better because the other part is more complicated. It has other things.
Okay, Armando, about Cuba.
Did we lose him?
No, I'm unmuting. But you can have some. I am interested in hearing about the current situation. Can you hear me? You can hear me. No, hold it.
Sure, I can hear you.
Yeah. All right. So I'm not going to get into a lot of things other than starting with the U.S. basically the impact of the war on Cuba was early on, where Cuba became a protectorate of the U.S., which meant basically Cuba was under the control of the U.S. for 4 years, from 1898 to 1902. And in that time, obviously, the Cuban was not necessarily in control of anything. The U.S. was there, and actually that's where some of the businesses started getting their hands in there. But the most important part of that was that they then became part of writing the Cuban Constitution. And particularly in the Cuban Constitution, when you look about impact, the biggest impact was the requirement that the Platt Amendment be annexed to the Constitution. And basically, the Platt Amendment gave the U.S. complete authority over any treaty or deals that the U.S. was making with other countries. U.S. could turn it down. The U.S. could intervene in Cuba at any time they felt that their democracy, if you will, was at risk. Elections, and they did on 2 separate occasions. In 1916 and 1928, the U.S. Became involved in the outcomes of Cuban elections to basically overturn them for the candidate that they wanted. Another big part of this was the military was able to stay, which had a huge impact on Cuba. And of course, with the military staying, they needed a location. So part of it was that the Cuba would lease them land for a military base, and that land ended up being Guantanamo. And that basically Cuba was only Cuba the island, but not Isla de Pino, which is now the Isla de la Juventud, Isle of Youth, was not considered part of Cuba. Cuba, when it was independent, only the island. And then eventually, because there were more Americans actually living in Isla de Pino than Cubans, so the Cubans had a lot of people move there, and then they were able to say, oh, this is really part of Cuba. But nevertheless, it was that type of a thing that the U.S. had power over, as well as Cuba, U.S. being able to intervene in any issue that they felt they wanted to. And back to the original pieces, they wanted, because of the Panama Canal was built, they wanted Puerto Rico and Cuba on the Caribbean Atlantic side, and they wanted the Philippines, Hawaii on the Pacific as a protectorate for that. And that's where Cuba came, obviously Cuba came in. And, during that time, Cuba got the voting of everybody in Cuba, except only for males. Women or blacks were not allowed to vote. The economy became very dependent on sugar. It truly became a mono production. And World War I spiked prices, the depression down. So it was an up and down economy, with many of the Cuban owners of those centrales going bankrupt and then being bought out by U.S. companies. So the economy then became very much dependent on U.S. Influence and Cuban money that was involved with sugarcane. Poverty was everywhere. There was over 500,000 people in a small population that were unemployed. But one of the main things that the U.S. wanted out of Cuba is they didn't want to annex Cuba, because annexation then meant you had to deal with, like Puerto Rico, you had to deal with all these issues. But if you made them independent and just an extension of the U.S. system, you can have the best of both worlds without having to deal with all the issues. And that's ultimately what they got all the way through the revolution in the 50s. which again was part of, which was started as a result of this. Student groups started to see the inequalities. They started to see the influence of the U.S. on Cuba, the Platt Amendment, and that led to the Cuban Communist Party, youth organizations at the University of Havana that eventually led to working with Batista, if you can believe it. Batista worked with the students, but then eventually became a dictator, and the rest is history as Cuba became an independent. But the impact of the initial impact of the Spanish-American War was huge on Cuba, and not necessarily in a good way.
Can I mention one thing before we turn to Hawaii? And that is that neither one of you mentioned that both Cuba and Puerto Rico were populated by slaves, by Black slaves. And that Havana in particular was a huge market, actually, where slaves were transported to Havana. Some came to North America and some didn't, but slavery really built the wealth of Cuba and Puerto Rico, but the wealth was eventually.
But that was before the U.S.
Yeah, exactly.
That was before, not post.
Right.
But Cuba was, as you're right, Sandy, just about every slave that came into the Americas passed through Cuba.
Cuba,
you know?
right.
Cuba controlled 50% of the slave trade of the whole Atlantic states.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why I don't think people really in the United States understand the whole connection with Africa in the Caribbean. That I don't think Americans even think of Cuba as a Black country. Or as a people of color country, mainly made up of people of color, because they see people like Armando in this country, and they think that Cubans are basically white, but they are not.
But the majority of the Cubans, even now, it's still not over 50% Black in Cuba.
No, but they're, as far as I can tell, there are a lot of people of color.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of people.
Yeah. But anyway. That was very profitable also for the New World, of course, was the slave trade. Okay, but Grant will maybe say a few words about Hawaii.
Okay, so I just come at this because at Burlington College I taught a course on cultural encounter, and we did a week on Hawaii, and that's where I learned a lot of the history of Hawaii, which I think maybe people don't know too much. Just a word, first of all, about the location, which is maybe we all know, but it's basically the latitude of Mexico west into the Pacific and sort of a third of the way across the Pacific between the Americas and the Philippines and Asia. And geography turns out to be a very important factor for what happened to Hawaii. It's a very interesting story because in Hawaii, there are profound changes going on exactly at the same time as the encounter with the Americans and the Europeans. Within Hawaii, in the 18th century, this all started, there was a reorganization going on. There had been wars and wars and wars going on between groups in the islands. Finally, there was an overall conservative monarchy installed over all the islands except Kauai. And for the first time, there was a unified government, a conservative monarchy. At that time, exactly, Captain James Cook, who you've probably heard of, who was an explorer, came to Hawaii. And from a European point of view, kind of discovered it. Of course, it was always there, but the Europeans weren't much familiar with it at all. This was 1778 and 1779 that he made 2 visits to Hawaii and published an account of his travels and an account of what he found in Hawaii. And this was widely read and widely known, and this sort of started this whole European and American influx into the islands. As part of this consolidation of the islands into a monarchy, oddly enough, from my point of view, what had been the religion of the Hawaiian island, the religions plural of the Hawaiian island, and all of their symbolism and all that was suppressed and eliminated basically. So Hawaii was sitting there with no religious factor to their society. And this created a religious void, which was important because into this religious void rushed New England missionaries, very largely Congregationalists, now known as the United Church of Christ. And they of course, wanted to convert all these people who suddenly didn't particularly have their own religion anymore into Christianity. And set about also becoming active in social and political spheres of island life. And did one side that they did was they created a written form of the Hawaiian language, which there never had been one of before. It was taught widely by them, and it's thought by mid 19th century about 100% of native Hawaiians were literate. In 1848, in mid-century again, the mahele was introduced, and the mahele was the change, drastic changes. There's a history of drastic changes for Hawaii for about a century. A drastic change in land use. So they go from collective ownership of land to private ownership of land, meaning, of course, any individual can own the land, can do with it what he, she, or wants, or consolidate it. This, of course, was favored by the growing class of plantation owners and farmers. And here, sort of like Cuba, Hawaii became hugely dependent on sugar and, of course, also pineapple. The two things we all probably know is the agricultural products of Hawaii. Another factor that we hear less about a lot are the whalers, who discovered that if they overwintered in Hawaii, they avoided their whole return trip out to South America, back up to New England, and back again the next year. So, of course, it saved them fantastic amounts of money and effort. So that toward the middle of the 1824 to 43, there were maybe 85 whaler ships overwintering in Hawaii. By 1846, up to 600. Now, this is not nothing. To have all of these ships with their crews spending several months of the winter, not out whaling, but on land, drinking and carousing and creating all kinds of mayhem. And it had a big effect on the Hawaiian society. Some of these ports and cities turned into little hellholes to live in for the Hawaiians. And there was a huge amount of upheaval because of them. But of course, what's important for us, I think, also, is that it, in addition to the social instability that led to, it also established Hawaii as an important and possible and convenient stopping over point between the Americas and Asia, and the whaling grounds, stopping over and resupplying on Hawaii, and that becomes very, very important pretty soon. The foreigners in Hawaii had a drastic effect there, as they did in the Caribbean, as they did in North America, especially through disease. And the native Hawaiian population, the indigenous population, was thought to have been around 400,000 to 800,000 in the 18th century before Captain Cook. A century later, in 1898, it's down to 40,000. So it's a decrease from hundreds of thousands to 40,000, or only a quarter of the total population anymore of their own islands, because there were foreign workers brought in and were taking over kind of really. And by the 1980s, there only are 2,000 speakers of native Hawaiian anymore. Now, a quick run through the U.S. takeover of the islands. It's a familiar story in a way, but it's a story also of striking while the Hawaiians themselves are at their weakest point. Their population has been decimated since the 18th century. The forms of government have been radically changed. A lot of social forms have changed. The religious forms have changed. In the end of the 19th century, in 1887, is the Bayonet Constitution. That monarchy established in the 18th century continues. It's King. Female. Well, it will be. Yeah. It's King David Kalakona, first of all, who signs a new constitution. He doesn't willingly sign it. He signs it literally under gunpoint. And of course, the forces who want this are the planters in the agricultural class. Then the monarchy changes because he died, and Queen Liliuokalani is queen. And the planters and businessmen set up a revolt against her and set up a provisional government, which changes its name into the Republic of Hawaii. This is 1894 now. The next year, the queen is imprisoned in her own palace, in the Iolani Palace in Honolulu. Next year, the Hawaiian language is banned as a language of instruction. And in 98, the big year that we're all talking about here, Hawaii is annexed by proclamation of the United States Congress. And she, the queen, protested vigorously about this in prison in her palace. She couldn't really do it in an armed way, but she wrote to the Congress, to the president, to everybody, protesting hugely. And you can get, this is in the UVM library and other places, you can get these documents and read them, which I have read some of them. So under protest, Hawaii is taken over by the United States. They simply declare, you're ours now. 1900, Hawaii becomes a territory. 1959, it's admitted as the 50th state upon a vote in Hawaii. But the vote is, we should become a state or not a state. Nothing about independence or anything else, of course. And in 1993, President Bill Clinton signs the Apology Bill, which is a proclamation by the US Congress apologizing to the Hawaiian people for what the United States did to them, meaning taking over their government, their property, and with no input from the Hawaiians except resistance. And so this proclamation is interesting because it enumerates explicitly what the United States did, how they promulgated a coup d'etat, how they took over, how they did not recompense the Hawaiians at all. And this is to say, gee, awfully sorry, because they're a state by now. So in that same year of 1898, this of course brings up numerous questions of issues of sovereignty, of indigenous rights within Hawaii, and there's a lot of movement about that, especially since the 1970s. There are associations and movements formally organized that militate for reinstatement of all things Hawaiian, and there are now a movement also of what you might call total immersion Hawaiian schools, where the entire day is taught only in Hawaiian. That has a lot to do with Hawaiian culture and so on. And there was a constitutional convention in the 1970s also to redo the constitution and revalorize a lot that's Hawaiian. Then my final word is that the annexation happened in 1898, but it wasn't by fiat by the president or something. It was the Congress, and it was a result of
Our Congress.
the United States Congress, and the result of a hot debate between those who are pro-expansion and pro-annexation, and those who are anti-expansion and anti-annexation. And these opinions kind of held sway back and forth for a couple of years until finally there was a period when the pro-annexation people were in power, and there was always annexation going on in the year of 1898, and so it carried, and the place was annexed. So that's what I'd like to say.
I would mention a few words about what happened also in the Philippines. At that time, in 1898, the Spanish-American War, the United States also established a presence in the Philippines and sort of began, I believe, this manifest destiny defined by our leaders at that time of becoming an empire rather than staying as a continental republic. The Anglophone part of the United States, of course, the English-speaking part of the United States, had already spread itself to the coast of California, defeating the Spanish Empire in Mexico in the War of 1846. But essentially, by this war, after the English-speaking parts of the continent had succeeded in its first destiny of controlling a continental republic, defeating the Native Americans, defeating the other empires, Spain that held grasp of part of North America, and the French. We can't forget the French as well. The United States then had established its grasp on the whole continent of North America, essentially, with the exception of Canada, and then it had also set the borders with Mexico. But then, in what many historians call manifest destiny 2, the United States really turned to overseas expansion by taking the last remaining Spanish parts of Latin America, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And I guess what you said, Jorge, was there were other places, though, that were still controlled by Spain in South America. Is that correct?
No. What I said is, no. Everything in South America was liberated in the 1820s.
Right, by Bolivar, right? Yeah.
By Bolivar and San Martin and O'Higgins and all the guys down there, okay? But the only two colonies left were Cuba and Puerto Rico. Dominican Republic and Haiti were problematic, and they were let go many years before. So one of them was an economic empire, which was Cuba. The other one was a leftover island that was at the entrance of the Atlantic. It had some strategic importance, but not much economics. Okay, but the U.S. Occupy or militarily intervene in because they were establishing a monocrop like Chiquita banana, in Nicaragua and in Panama because of the Panama Canal, and so in all these countries there was a boom of export agricultural products, usually monocrops. So they went in and approved and supported, big American companies going in and buying large pieces of land so that this agricultural economy started going. So that's where all these interventions went, I mean, in some of them were not even interventions, but they were economically influencing the economies.
Can I mention one other very important date in this history, and that's 1823 and the Monroe Doctrine.
Of course, that's where it started.
In 1823, it wasn't clear about what country nation would be hegemonic in the Americas. By 1823, if I'm not mistaken, however, all of South America had thrown off Spain. Is that true? By 1823, and they had established themselves as independent republics in Latin America, correct?
Most of them.
But the United States at that time issued a rather rash, it appeared at the time, decision to say to the European powers in 1823, we're not going to let you back here to colonize any of the Americas anymore. And if you try, we will defend the independence of those republics. So it kind of cut both ways. It put the United States in the position of being hegemonic in all of the Americas, but it also meant that the United States had become so powerful that it could actually tell those independent republics that they couldn't either go on their own way, really, that the United States was going to decide foreign policy for them as well. And I believe that, so the Monroe Doctrine that was a very important date, it appears to me. It's when the United States really announced itself as the most powerful nation in all of the Americas, right?
Yes, and that was followed up by the Roosevelt Corollary.
Exactly.
Okay?
Yeah,
By
right.
Teddy Roosevelt Corollary, which further imposed that there was not even any relationship with Europeans here.
Right.
You know, as you know, Teddy was one of the colonels in the Rough Riders in Puerto Rico.
Right. Was he in Cuba also, Teddy Roosevelt?
I don't think so. Was
Yeah.
he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Joanne?
They stormed San Juan Hill,
What was San Juan?
which most Americans think they assume it's in San Juan, Puerto Rico, but it's actually a hill in Santiago de
Santiago.
Cuba.
In Santiago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right. Okay, are there any other questions or thoughts? Can I just say one thing is I do believe, though, that as the war extended U.S. power in the Pacific, the United States had designs at that point on China. And these were kind of stepping stones to get involved in China as well, which continues, well, not anymore because the Chinese said forget it. But anyway, Kurt.
Yeah, just an interesting little tidbit as you're talking about the Pacific portion of the Manifest Destiny doctrine. With respect to the Philippines, after the Spanish-American War was over, the United States was engaged in its first real foray into guerrilla warfare, as we knew from Vietnam, in the Philippines. It was a brutal occupation, but the Filipinos, because of the number of islands they have, they were very difficult to subjugate. And they fought back using guerrilla warfare tactics that we saw several decades later in some of the islands during the Second World War in Japan against the Japanese army, and then 20, 30 years later again in Vietnam.
Right. Can I ask you a question, Kurt? Those Filipinos who fought back and led that struggle, I think they might have been Muslim. Were they Muslims?
There was a small portion of them that were Muslim because of their proximity to Indonesia,
Right.
but they were mostly Catholic. The Spanish had Catholicized most people from the Philippines. If you look at their names, they sound like Spanish names.
Right.
I mean, they speak their own language, a language called Tagalog.
Yeah.
But Spanish is pretty widespread in the Philippines, and they worship in a Catholic style liturgy in the Philippines, and they're very, very dedicated Catholics.
Yeah.
Most years around Easter, you'll hear stories about a lot of people, again on the extreme, but they actually get involved in crucifixions the way Jesus Christ was, with the nail and the whole thing, to show their loyalty and their love for Christ and what he did and what he went through. So it's a very Catholic, Catholicized country, except for certain areas where apparently in the last 20 years, Al Qaeda was actually able to create a presence in the Philippines, and the U.S. military as well as the Filipino military had a couple of small-sized battles in some of these islands to root out Islamic extremism.
Right. That's what I kind of thought. Okay, are there any other questions or thoughts?
I have one.
Go ahead.
How does Brazil fit into this whole business that goes on in South America? Does it?
Brazil,
Yeah,
Brazil has a political history that's completely different.
that's what I
Right.
think.
Brazil didn't have a war of independence.
Right.
Brazil,
Right.
what happened is that because of the Napoleonic Wars, the Portuguese who controlled Brazil had to move they were invaded, so they had to move the whole kingdom to Brazil. So when when the wars were over, the old king went back to Portugal and he left his son, and then later his son's independence.
But Brazil is nevertheless, isn't it also correct that all of the South American countries are republics? There are no monarchies left.
No, there are not. Yeah, but Brazil remained a monarchy
Right.
in the 1800s when they independence themselves.
Right.
So they actually republic. They become a republic.
Right. The Caribbean islands, some of them are still connected to monarchs in
Well,
Europe, correct? Like
yeah.
Jamaica, right?
The
Well,
ABC Island.
It's part of the British,
Right.
Yeah.
There's one monarchy in
Aruba is one of those.
Right.
right, and there's French too, Martinique. No,
No,
the
no,
French
no,
are right.
Yikes.
The French are
Guadeloupe.
right,
Yeah.
they're sister. Well, we have one monarchy left though in the Americas. I used to have big fights with my students about this, which is what? Canada.
Yeah.
Canada. Yeah. I used to have huge fights because everybody is, of course, of the opinion that the Canadians are so much more progressive than we are. But
Okay.
they do have a monarchy.
Back in the middle of a meeting.
Any other? Earhart, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Earhart.
What's your name?
Hi, Grant. Hi, Robin. Thanks for the presentations. Yeah, I thought this topic sounded really interesting. I've been meaning to zoom in on one of your conversations. Sandy, you really raised the point that I wanted to raise, which was, if you want to look at the roots of manifest destiny, I mean, they go back to the Louisiana Purchase, they go back to the Monroe Doctrine. And, frankly, I mean, our supposed American revolutionaries were, they were sort of, I always think of them as, to be truly revolutionary, you have to liberate yourself. They were part of, basically the British kind of, they were not far from the British ruling class, and they were just another ruling class. And they, basically ultimately imposed themselves on their will and the will of the country on the Americas
yes and no, but the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are very important documents. Yes, our founding fathers are deeply flawed.
I don't want to downplay that, but
Please don't, because you'll really get me going on that one.
I don't want to downplay that, but I always think about, to be truly liberated, you've got to, liberate yourself. And,
Yeah, I know, but
they were slaveholders and, all of that. And a lot of their great ideas came from, the Iroquois Nation and,
a lot of their great ideas too came from the Enlightenment ideas that were promulgated in Europe as well. So yes, you're right. But nevertheless, read the Declaration of Independence again. Okay, Kurt.
No, just as a follow-up to that point, maybe we're going off on a tangent, but in addition to the Enlightenment, it's also very important. If you look at the buildings in Washington, D.C., and really most government buildings in the United States, the Founding Fathers also relied heavily on the Greek democracy.
Yes.
And
right.
Greek democracy was consistent, even though it was the first of its kind, there was slavery.
Yep.
And they were able to, be okay with that. And also, women didn't have a right to participate in Greek democracy. And, a lot of the founding fathers were of that opinion also.
We understand that. However, again, read the Constitution and read the Declaration of Independence. Those documents were aspirational. Very few other countries have such aspirational documents or aspirations to be a democracy or even a republic. Most of the countries at that time, remember, were despots, ruled by despots or monarchs. So I'm just taking a class right now, actually, in history since 1500, global history since 1500. And when you get to the age of revolutions, it's astounding what those revolutions really did accomplish. Here in the United States, followed by France, followed by Haiti, which was probably the most radical of revolutions, was probably Haiti, and then the Bolivarian revolutions throughout South America. Those were truly progressive moments in history, at least aspirationally, with all of the problems. The biggest problem for me was the extermination of Native Americans and also slavery, of course. But anyway, that's my pitch about history. That the New World is a revolutionary New World still, at least contradicted by places which have no freedom at all. Yeah, Robin.
Yeah. Sorry, my battery died and I had to reignite myself. Yeah, well, I'm glad you're getting to Haiti. I wanted to just say that this all became real to me when I was in Haiti and I was interviewing President Aristide in 1991. And he said, my goal in my administration in 14 years is to bring alphabetization to all the people and to have a real examination of the slave trade in 2004. And he was, working on alliances with Brazil and back with, Sierra Leone and the countries in Africa to really show people what that whole trade was like and help people understand it. And of course, he was overthrown, and then he came back again. And then right on 2004, he was overthrown the second time. So, the powers that be, the white powers, the United States, didn't want to give Haiti any chance to celebrate the 200th anniversary of their revolution and to talk about the slave trade at that time. So Haiti has been suffering for decades.
Right. And continues to this day. By the way, we're hoping in this series to have a presentation on Haiti, on the revolution in Haiti, which was, it's so astounding to me that the revolution in Haiti, the revolution in France, and the Bolivarian revolutions looked to the revolution in the United States as key, that they were following the example of the most, to them, radical parts of the US revolution. And we so seldom think that revolution was radical in any way. But of course, at that period of time, at least in its aspirations, it was a very radical movement. But Haiti, after that point, was totally shunned by the United States. Is that true, Robin?
Yes.
And penalized for being the first Black republic in the world. Tim.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe ask Jorge, since we have some time, if he could comment on the current situation in Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Because it clearly remains the oldest colony in the world, over 500 years of being a colony, and has never attained independence. And the United States has imposed on it that financial junta, which is now making all the financial decisions and taking the power away from the Puerto Rican legislature to oversee its own economy. So it's tremendous debt in which it's
Killing it.
Yeah.
Killing it, yeah. I don't really see what the exit strategy is for Puerto Rico, which has been in a depression for the last decade and more.
Yeah.
Jorge.
Well, regarding the current events, I know that it's an attempt to renegotiate the debt, but the problem is the cash flow situation in Puerto Rico. And my understanding is that ever since Maria and now the pandemic, there's an outflux of population. I don't know if you know, but the
yes.
population is decreasing in the last 10 years. and tremendously. And who goes is really the professionals that should stay,
Yeah.
if you want to rebuild the country. So my understanding is that right now it is, and there, of course, we all know there's a junta or there is a governing body, but that's just part of colonialism. It's like a bank. If you don't pay the mortgage, then the bank tells you, well, we're gonna take control of your house. So that's what's happening. It's in Puerto Rico. It's like the property, and it's owned by the banks of the United States, or by the investors of the United States. So we're treated like a property, and that's what it is. Now, in terms of, is that right or not? I'm not I don't. Everybody has their own opinion. I'm just saying the fact is that we are under the U.S. control, and if a big company goes to Nicaragua, American company, and it has billions of dollars, well, and then the Nicaraguan government expropriates it, then the U.S. will invade. It's because you take their money, and that is basically what's happening in Puerto Rico, in my view.
It's already invaded.
I'm
What?
sorry.
Puerto Rico is already invaded.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, exactly. There's nothing to invade already. but now, investors put money in bonds, and they were badly administered. The funds and the transactions, because they were both badly administered. So now how do you go after it? You can't invade. But you still own the country, so you can force them to pay, because you cannot put a junta like there is one in Puerto Rico to France because they owe you money. You couldn't do that. You could do it to Puerto Rico because it's a colony.
Mhm.
So that is now. If you want, there's a series of events that happened prior to this. Puerto Rico, as it changed from agriculture to manufacturing in the 40s and 50s, Operation Bootstrap. Well, what happened there, to incentivize in 1976, there was a 936 tax incentive law that let companies not have to repatriate their funds. So that was an incentive, and there was a lot of manufacturing, and that's how the economy of Puerto Rico was really good, up till the 1976. And then that law came out, later in the 80s, and, it phased out in 2000. And basically the economy of Puerto Rico, which was manufacturing, is pretty much dead.
Yeah.
And so we don't have the multi-crop economy that we had prior to occupation. Then that got replaced by a monocrop in sugar, and that got replaced by a manufacturing with incentives, and none of that is there. So how do you go from being on 500 years of colony to revamp or restart or jumpstart an economy that has nothing left? I mean, it has to start from scratch.
Can I mention another thing that happened as a result, I think, of the Spanish-American War, and that is the establishment, as someone said, of Guantanamo, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And that was, I think, in 1902, when the United States demanded and got a military base, a naval base in Cuba. That remains true to this day. That was supposed to be a lease, if I recall, for 100 years. And then the Cubans,
Sandy, not for 100 years, it's in perpetuity. And there is rent.
Oh, right, but
rent that the U.S. owes the Cuban government. The Cuban government, since Castro, has never accepted the payment.
Right.
Money, and it was established as a coaling station.
Right.
And if you read the treaty carefully, since it is no longer a coaling station, because ships don't operate on coal anymore, in a sense, the treaty could be abrogated. It could be declared void because it is not performing the function on which it was established.
But I'm sure that Fidel Castro tried to get us out of there, and then the United States said, make us go. And that can't happen without a war. I mean,
Well,
that.
there you go. There you go. Yeah.
But we
it's no
played a good
longer
role
base
for
at
Fidel.
all. It's a
Having
prison.
What,
Right.
what, Armando?
Having Guantanamo there was also good for Fidel. He could use that
Maybe.
as a symbol
Of course,
of
of course.
Yeah.
So-
it's a big
So
thing.
I know all that. The problem is that I can't believe in a way that the United States has foreign bases at all, anywhere, but especially Cuba, that it now is a prison and that has not been given up by the United States. It's not
Randy, how many countries does the US have,
basis.
about 700.
800, 800.
Exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
There's 700 bases. It's not a 700 countries.
But they don't,
No,
I'm
that's
not,
right, yeah.
what?
You're right, 700 countries.
Bases.
No,
not
no, no.
700
Bases.
Bases.
Right, right.
I'm sorry.
Unless you go to outer space.
700 foreign bases. Well, we're going to have a base on Mars too. Yeah, Robin.
Yeah.
Robin.
Yeah, I just want to explain, I'm leaving because I'm going to see the premiere of Jetline, Voices from the F-35. This is a new film made by
Oh.
Dwan Peterman. And you can just, it's starting at 7, and you can just type in jetlinefilm.com and you will get the link to go to see this premiere of this film.
By the way, I noticed, Byron, but I
Yeah,
noticed
but-
Earhart works for Bernie Sanders now. Is that right, Earhart?
I had to take that. I'm not here in my official capacity, but yes,
No,
I
no.
do.
Okay, so now then you can bring all this up with Senator Sanders, I'm sure. The F-35s, the occupation of Puerto Rico, the occupation of, or the embargo, right? We're gonna
Right.
create-
What was it? Jetline?
I'm his eyes and ears now. So from your lips to
Well, you can wish him well, but
thanks.
yeah.
I've got to go too. I have a neighborhood planning assembly coming up,
My
but I
neighborhood.
really appreciated the presentations. Thank you, Jorge and Armando and Grant. It's too bad. I wanted to mention Robin's left, but one of the things that's kept Haiti down is the reparations that they paid to France. I don't know if folks mentioned
Unbelievable.
that. But
They've had to pay
if I'm
to
not
France.
mistaken, they didn't end till the early 70s. I think they
Right.
continued to pay
Right.
into the early 70s
And then France made them pay too.
To France.
to France.
They had to
For
pay
the
for their
loss of the
own
territory.
liberation.
That's right, they had to pay for the slaves that became free. They're no
Yeah.
longer property.
I saved those.
Well, Joanne and I would like to meet Jorge sometime.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you, Maddie. Take care.
When is he going to be back in this state? Anybody?
No, when they invite me, let's see.
We're invited,
Yeah,
right? Tim?
until Labor Day. maybe.
Why, where are you, Jorge?
I'm in Miami Beach.
Oh, okay, I see.
Let me ask you a question. Did anybody know that the first Haitian government that wasn't a colony was a kingdom?
Oh,
Yeah,
No, you didn't know that. There was a
well,
black king. There was a black king there.
that's right.
Right after independence, after they killed Toussaint Louverture, there was Dessalines.
yes.
That was and then after Dessalines, there was a king there that's mentioned in a book by a Cuban called The Kingdom of This World, and that's the first kingdom that was from a African, born in Haiti right after independence.
Mhm.
I heard that. I mean, Haiti is in terrible shape again. Well, it always is, but it's especially bad right now. Is that right?
Of course.
I heard because we want to.
After that, there was the earthquake.
The earthquake.
That-
But Sandy, most recently, apparently, there's the phenomenon of gangs in
Yeah.
hundreds of gangs, literally
I know.
hundreds of gangs that kidnap people.
Right. I heard that on the news tonight.
Yeah.
Because I mentioned that because this semester, we had an interview for VICII and for our session with Tim Reeser, who's the advisor to Senator Leahy, and he talked a great deal about Cuba. I don't know if you guys joined that, but we're going to ask him because he's been in negotiations also about Haiti. And we're going to ask him to come next semester, maybe even next month, to give us.
And the
an update.
negotiations, Sandy,
Right.
the negotiations are specifically about a kidnapping, Tim, back to what Tim was saying. The
You heard
negotiations, the negotiations that Tim is involved with in Haiti is of a Haitian student studying in New Jersey. I think it was at Rutgers, whose family was kidnapped. So my point is that Tim is mentioning kidnapping, and that's what Tim was working on. The other Tim Reeser was working on when we were on the call with him.
When will Biden move on Cuba?
Never.
To reverse all the Trump,
Especially Biden won't.
No, he won't.
He said he was going to, but now
You mean to authorize travel or what?
Yes.
to open up the way it was.
Well,
under-
you can travel. It's just you can't right now, Tim. There's only one app. They can only fly to Havana. They can't do any remittances yet. The embassy, the consulate office is closed in Havana, so you have these thousands of Cubans who've had appointments or visa applications that are in limbo. So, I mean, that hurts the Cubans in Miami, the same Cubans who say that they want to tighten the grip on Cuba.
You know how you can send remittances, Armando? If you do a recarga for a telephone in Cuba, they can now convert it.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do that. I've been doing that for a long time. I think Western Union maybe is not back yet, but
not quite, but they're going to be, I think.
yeah.
So what you charge $150 and they sell it over there.
They can do that. Yes, exactly.
They sell the minutes.
Exactly.
Awesome.
The Cuban American Friendship Society wants to go back as soon as possible. We have a friend there who is the head now of the Mozart Festival. Did I send you the latest message from Michael Dabrowski? He's having a great life. It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, there is.
He's got money.
What?
He's got dollars.
Well, I know, but he also is getting to teach a lot, which is really he teaches the violin, right?
Yep.
Okay, well, I don't know. Any further questions?
All right.
Thank you, Armando and then Jorge.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
I'll
everyone.
do it
Kurt, it
anytime.
was nice seeing you again. Joanne, Tim.
Good seeing you
See you guys
too.
soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cuídate, Jorge.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.